So let's start at the beginning. What is a firm? In the traditional or neoclassical theory of economics, we define the firm as a collection of resources that is transformed into products that are demanded and purchased by consumers. Now, in economics, in economic theory, we don't get into details of how the firm operates. All that's important for the theory is that they do something to change those resources into a product that consumers want. But the firm makes choices. They decide how to produce, how much to produce, what to price it at. Or more accurately, not the firms make choices, but people within the firms make choices. Now, the choices aren't just, up to them to do whatever they want. They're based on the market and market feedback. If they're wrong, if they don't provide what consumers in the market want, or they do so at a higher price, the firm will suffer. But if they do it right, they'll end up doing well. The goal is to maximize profits, and if the firm is publicly traded, to maximize the return for shareholders. So profit is the difference between the revenue received for the products that they sell and the cost incurred for producing them. So, a simple formula is price of each good times the number of units sold equals the revenue minus the costs equals profit. Now, this is more of an accounting sense. Later on, we'll talk about it in an economic sense, which includes more costs, including opportunity costs. So the other alternatives that firms could actually do. But in the accounting sense, this is what profit is. But this theory doesn't get at why firms exist. I can hear you groaning, even though I'm pre-recording this, I can hear you groaning through the screen right now that I'm bringing in more theory. But there's a question is why do firms actually exist? And given that they exist, why do they perform some functions themselves within the firm and others through the market, through contracting with other firms? The answer for both is transaction cost. Arnold Coase, the great economist, right after World War II, wrote about the theory of the firm, and his whole idea was about transaction cost. So every time a firm enters into a contract or attempts to enter into a contract, there are costs associated with engaging in that transaction. So there's the time to investigate, to figure out who they should go contract with. There's the time and the cost of the negotiation, not only the time you're spending, but like hiring lawyers and things like that. And then there's the cost of enforcing contracts and monitoring to make sure they're living up to their end of the contract. So, for instance, I used to work for my summer job for a dorm furniture factory. And they were very proud that all their products were made in the USA, but not every part of that product was made in the USA. For them, it was cheaper to buy the nuts and the bolts, the screws and nails, all the sorts of little metal things from foreign companies. I think it was mostly from Vietnam, rather than purchasing from American companies or from making it in-house. The reason they did that is because the transaction cost of finding a supplier from another country was lower than actually going through and making it themselves, adding in all the new capital equipment that they would need in order to make nails and screws and things like that. So it's transaction costs that determine the size of the firm. So like I said, anytime the firm tries to enter into a new contract, there's going to be transaction costs associated with it, whether they're successful or whether they just search and don't end up entering a contract. Now, there are a few influences for this. The first is uncertainty. You don't know whether the party you're contracting with, say it's your potential supplier, whether they're going to be high quality or not. You can get a decent idea ahead of time, but you don't know whether it's going to work out well or not until you actually go through with it, unfortunately. There's also the frequency of reoccurrence of needing to negotiate these contracts or to search for new partners. If you're constantly searching or regularly searching, it's going to be expensive, not just in the time of going out and finding a new supplier, but also the negotiation process and hiring lawyers to draw up the contracts, all that kind of stuff. And finally, there's the idea of asset specificity. So asset specificity is when the buyer contracts with one specific seller for a specialized product, for just one thing that they need that's not being used by other firms. In that situation, the buyer of the specific piece becomes tied to the seller, and that seller has market power over them. So they could, and I hate to use this term, exploit them. They can use their market power to sell at higher and higher prices, get terms of the contract that are much more favorable to them than if there was actual robust competition. If the firm had multiple other companies they could go to, that wouldn't be a problem. But because they're only dealing with one supplier, there can be serious problems with that for the firm. And because of that risk, it makes it easier for the firm to handle in-house. So from they'll end up producing that part often instead of contracting with someone else. So for instance, say you're Dyson and you need a special part for your vacuum cleaners that no one else in the industry uses because that's what sets you apart. If you're dealing with an outside supplier, they have a lot of market power over you. Odds are they're the only one making that part as well. So you're in a situation where they could charge pretty high prices for you. And if they go back, renege on the contract, if they break it or something, it'll be much harder for you to deal with them and force them to fix it because, again, they can tell you to pound salt. Who else are you going to go to? So it's easier for Dyson, in this case, to handle that in-house, to make those products or that part of their product themselves rather than contracting outside. So because of this, transaction costs can determine the size of the firm, whether you're going to be a large company that's producing all the parts they need or whether you're just doing like the final manufacturing. Now, I always think of manufacturing as the easiest example for these, probably because that's like the most real world experience I had, but there's a lot of other areas of transaction cost. So there's things like offshoring to source consumer products. So imagine retail stores. You decide, should you make the products you're selling in the store yourself, or should you buy it from, a low-cost producer in another country? Then there's manufacturing components overseas. So this is more like the example I was talking about, like the automotive industry. They said that the, your classic like Chevy sedan, that's a very American car, but it was really an international product. Parts were made all around the world. They were designed in Germany. Some were built in Canada. Some are built in Taiwan. Some in Korea. What do? They bring them over to America and they assemble them there. So this is just deciding, do you want to build everything in-house, focus on all the different components that go into a car, or do you want to outsource some of that and then, do the final manufacturing, the final all work in your facilities. And there's logistics services. So you have a lot of places that outsource logistics services. So they're going to use warehousing and delivery through someone else who specializes in that, rather than keeping that all in-house. Obviously, it's much cheaper to contract with a trucking firm that's dedicated to trucking and warehousing than it is to hire and maintain a trucking fleet if you're a smaller manufacturing firm. Another example of transaction costs is human resources and bureaucracy. Over time, as firms grow larger and larger, just the cost of managing all those people gets extremely expensive. Typically, when we think of bureaucracy, we think of government agencies. They're bureaus, they deal without the profit motive. So they set up these procedural rules to make sure that everyone does their job as well as possible, because they don't have the benefit of the profit and loss mechanism from the market. But we see this in large companies as well, and this can be extremely costly. So one of the problems with IBM, who was one of the greatest computer manufacturing companies in the world for decades and decades, they became so large and so bureaucratic. If anyone wanted to make a decision or launch a new product, it had to go through so many different approvals that they could veto pretty much any new idea. And that's what happened. And these smaller, more nimble startups had great ideas and were able to overtake them. Another example is my mom worked for St. Jude medical device firm. They were fairly small, and they had a lot of freedom to operate. But they were purchased a couple of years ago by Abbott Laboratories, a large medical device firm. They were much more bureaucratic, so they have very defined roles. Who can say what, who can agree to what, who can negotiate this contract, who has to go ask for permission for it, and it becomes a lot more costly to manage. It slows the company down. So here we have a graph, because economists love graphs and can't go too long without using one. And it helps to illustrate the limits to the size of firms. So the thick, darker line is external transactions. So if a firm solely relied on outside sources, so if it was literally you with a bunch of money paying people for all the parts, paying them to do everything themselves in manufacturing, paying other people to sell it, handling none of that yourself. The thinner solid line is internal operations. So you're doing everything yourself in-house. You're hiring all the people to do it, not contracting with anyone else outside. And dashed line is a total. Odds are you're not going to be 100% one way or the other. You're going to be some combination. And it's some combination of internal operations and external transactions. You'll minimize your costs. And this helps to illustrate the trade-off, that at some point, it's going to be cheaper if you're handling everything in-house. It'll be cheaper to contract outside with some people. Maybe it'll be like shipping and logistics. Maybe it'll be sourcing the very small components for manufacturing. Maybe it'll be both. But over time, as you add more and more external transactions, you're going to lower your cost to a certain point. Once you reach that certain point, going even further is going to be more expensive. At that point, the cost of finding a supplier, negotiating the contracts, those sorts of things are going to become more expensive than if you just handle it in-house. So a company is going to choose to allocate their resources so that their total cost is minimized for a given level of output. We'll get into more of the theory behind this later, but it should make some intuitive sense that you're going to try to spend as little money as possible in actually producing and selling your goods. The lower your costs are, the higher your accounting profit can be. So if there's what this calls peripheral, non-core activities or more expensive activities that other companies are better suited to doing, you can save money in a lot of instances by purchasing the services or the products from them directly instead of trying to do it yourself. But the transaction costs can change over time. So you think about it, if you're an independent firm and you're trying to decide you're going to produce a product, if only a few customers want that product, then odds are you're not going to offer it. You're not going to be able to get enough money from them in order to justify, producing this new product and trying to sell it on the market. However, once that market starts to expand and demand for a product or service increases, now you're going to want to reconsider that. Now you can make much more money. So let's say, for instance, let's look at college bookstores. Originally, when there weren't that many universities, it wasn't that profitable to come in and offer your services as a bookstore. Imagine one firm offering, controlling all the college bookstores. But over time, as there's more and more universities, each one has a bookstore there, suddenly it makes more sense to get into the market. There's a lot more buyers, a lot more revenue that you can take in from that. So now what we see is specialized firms running these sorts of things at universities. So cleaning services, security, cafeterias, bookstores, things like that being offered not by the university themselves, but by a large chain or a couple large companies being able to handle that. As there's more and more universities, there's a larger market for these services. The cost of producing it goes down, the transaction cost of negotiating goes down, and it ends up being something you now used to handle in-house, but you now want to go and purchase from another firm. We hear a lot about offshoring, about going and contracting with parties, firms in other countries in order to produce either components of the products or the products entirely. So there can be issues with offshoring. Obviously, you can lower costs of the firms, but there's also often lower quality, and then you're relying on someone else to be able to source the product. So we saw all the supply chain difficulties that are still occurring and are going to occur for a long time because of the disruptions due to COVID. Because of these disadvantages, we've been seeing some reshoring going on. So returning operations to the country where the offshoring originally occurred. So for example, the United States not originally, but in the 1990s, offshoring a lot of the products they're purchasing or the components of the products to China, when we slapped a bunch of tariffs on China, moving to other places in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, for instance. Now we're seeing them coming back. The firms located in the United States are now purchasing from other firms in the US or beginning to handle things in-house again. And there are some signs that we've been seeing related to that. So wages in developing countries, including the United States, have been rising, especially within the types of industries that we're talking about where reshoring will be taking place. We've had a decrease in the value of the dollar has increased the cost of importing goods. The cost of importing goods has also been increased by tariffs within the past, 5, 6, 7 years now. Sometimes there's increases in energy costs. So energy costs were falling in, I think, 2016. They were also falling again more recently. But then during COVID, we've had, after the initial drop for the first maybe 6, 8, 10 months, price of energy has increased again. That makes it more expensive to ship. And manufacturing firms have significantly increased productivity as we adopt more and more technological advances. And you see like the videos online of of those Amazon factories, autonomous factories, like the robots going around, picking everything off the shelves, moving around in a coordinated fashion, makes firms here that much more competitive instead of relying on labor that doesn't necessarily require a lot of education, but is still fairly expensive in the United States from at least from the firm's perspective. Now, if we're relying on more technology, we can reduce the cost of doing that here. That's not to say that offshoring isn't taking place anymore, or that reshoring is suddenly replacing all the jobs that were lost throughout the 90s and 2000s and the 2010s even. But this is a process that's occurring right now, and it's something to keep in mind, especially if you're out there, you're trying to make a decision in running your firm. Options are not just to move some of the production overseas, but also to move some of it back in other cases. When Ronald Coase wrote about the theory of the firm and his several other works on transaction costs back in the 30s and 40s, this is long before the internet. But his ideas are actually more relevant now with the internet. So if you search for transaction cost Coase internet, you will see a lot of hits of people applying his ideas of transaction costs to the new world with the internet, where we're all more connected and all that stuff. So he talked about the trade-offs between internal costs and external transactions. So whether it's cheaper and easier, again, to purchase or produce things in-house or purchase them from someone else. But technology has reduced the search cost. So it's improved efficiency and allows firms to be able to contract with firms all the way around the world that they never were able to before. So now you don't have to spend as much money producing something yourself if you're very inefficient at it, when you can purchase from someone else, but you can actually be much more aware of their level of quality. You can find other reviews. You can go to clearinghouses where they will evaluate the firms, show their financial conditions, compare the price, the quality, and the delivery dates of one potential supplier versus a whole host of other potential suppliers. I'm not aware of too much research into this for actually managing like supply chains for business, but I can speak to occupational licensing and professional regulation, my specific area of research. Recently, there's been a couple pieces that have found that consumers are really good at using these online clearinghouses that provide ratings and provide, comparisons for a whole host of different service providers, and they're able to do it basically to minimize the problems that are happening or to maximize their, so-called utility or their enjoyment from it. But not just as it's going on with, individuals looking for services, it's also going on with, with producers looking for partners to contract with. So you could blame NAFTA, you can blame the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we are unfortunately not a part of, but this sort of offshoring, these partnering with firms in other countries around the world based on your comparative advantage would be going on regardless of those specific trade agreements because of the internet, substantially lowering transaction costs. It lowers uncertainty and it brings to producers a whole host of all these different potential partners. So not only do you have more detailed knowledge of the firms you would have contracted with in the past, you now have a lot more firms to choose from. So it makes finding a firm to engage in these external transactions with that much cheaper and that much easier.